I would like to talk about multiple diasporas rather than one, and about their multiple others, about how otherness travels and haunts, and about how a diasporic longing to belong can become a complicity in a violent national and colonial regime. Let me start with a very brief ethnographic detour into the story of my research and my first book about Russian-Israeli queer organizing and collective spaces that emerged in the early to mid-2000s, which became the base of this book, Figuration of Violence and Belonging. Over 1 million immigrants from the former Soviet Union have arrived in Israel since 1989, welcomed by the country's racialized law of return. While continuously erasing the Palestinian residents from London citizenship rights, the law grants full legal status and financial support to all Jews and their family members, regardless of age, gender, and sexuality, when they arrive to settle in the country. The immigration and settlement of all Russian-speaking newcomers, queers and straights alike, is part of the massive post-Soviet exodus, a wave of immigration following perestroika and later the collapse of the Soviet Union, which scattered the former communist empire across Europe, North America, and the Middle East. Israel, in other words, was only one of many destinations, and Germany, as you know, is another. Though the ability to choose a destination was shaped by global political forces, but that's another conversation. Today, these immigrants are connected to their place of birth and to each other through language, everyday practices, and effective dispositions, and through a shared past. Post-Soviet, rather than merely Russian or Ukrainian or Siberian, they're descendants of a country that was forever until it was no more, to use Alexei Yurchak's words. This, in other words, is a diaspora that has both a geographic and a temporal orientation. But in Israel, the post-Soviet Jewish immigration was defined by the state and indeed increasingly perceived by many of the immigrants themselves as a national homecoming from historical scattering. The very law of return, for example, defines Jewish immigration as return from the diaspora. In that respect, it is a nation based on the ending of, or as some would even argue, the erasure of Jewish diaspora in favor of a settler national state, which at the same time is dependent on those same diasporas as a bottomless demographic supplier. Because obviously people need to keep coming to keep the nation state Jewish. And that very return from the diaspora also causes and violently sustains another diaspora, that of the Palestinians, driven out of their land and homes, villages and cities, either beyond the border of the Jewish state or inside it, as internal refugees and aliens within. This double diaspora of creation and erasure is also a diaspora of collective amnesia, or rather of persistent collective erasure of the past, while traces of Palestinian presence are scrupulously overwritten or hidden from view, or turned into ghosts, while the land is populated with new memories, shifting between spaces of biblical temporalities and sites of commemoration of the European Jewry during the Holocaust, which in turn is fed into the current so-called war on terror against the Palestinians. So even though many of the Russian Israelis define their immigration as flight from the collapsing Soviet Union and as a project of economic necessity and family survival, and even though their cultural and social life is in many respects vibrantly diasporic, the move to and settlement in Israel is inseparable from the colonial visions of the Zionist project, creating, as they call it, a country for people without land in the land without people. Past experience of racialization and non-belonging as Jews, and ongoing instances of ethnic and sexual marginalization as newcomers, and also in the specific case of my research as queers, can make the promise of such national homecoming particularly tempting, as one transitions from a racial and ethnic minority into a national majority. And this is a structural and effective shift that is usually completely overlooked in research and political discussion, or reduced to simplistic dichotomies of victims of beneficiaries of racial regimes, whereas they should be discussed as both. It is no wonder then that the Russian-Israeli queer scene emerged at the intersection of the diasporic and the violently nationalist, a migrant longing of having a space of familiarity and connection away from being stigmatized as a newcomer, and a bear hug of the nation, a seductive embrace that offers conditional love in return for patriotic loyalty.